a lovely warm welcome this morning. I love coming to Chelmsford because you're such lovely people, and thank you for making us feel at home this morning. And thank you for the mix of the old and the new, and the traditional and the new, and I love it, and I hope you do too. I'll leave you to decide at the end of this whether you think it's the old or the new, or somewhere in between, I don't know. But anyway, so I haven't got an exhortation specifically based on Acts chapters that we've read, but there is a chapter in Acts that I do want to focus in on. And at the end of the day, it's all one story, isn't it? It's all one connected story. This is the continuing Acts of Jesus that we're reading, right? It's not the Acts of the Apostles so much as this is the continuing Acts of Jesus, okay, through the Apostles. So that's how we need to understand this whole kind of record. And in particular, I want us to go back to Acts chapter 8, in actual fact. But there are a couple of kind of stepping stones that appear in the readings that we've just done, which provide a little bit of a link, or it created a bit of a link in my mind at least anyway. Two things that, in isolation, just as I mentioned them, they mean nothing to you, but when we go back to Acts chapter 8, hopefully it will start to kind of fit into your mind. The first little comment is in Acts chapter 24 that we read. Here's Paul in front of Felix, and it's a little comment in verse 17 of chapter 24, where Paul is explaining that after an absence of several years, he says, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. Verse 18, I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. And that struck me as being a slightly odd statement of Paul. I was ceremonially clean. I never really thought about it before. He was this kind of, Jewish upstanding, kind of once upon a time anyway. And I never really thought about the fact that he would either be ceremonially clean or unclean, but, there it is. So that's a slightly odd little bit. Then there's another bit in chapter 26, in actual fact, 26. And here is Paul in front of Agrippa. He's moved on to face Agrippa. All this is ahead of his kind of final destination that he wants to get to Rome. And in verse 16 of chapter 26, it explains why Paul is doing all this, and what was driving him on. What was it that he was so concerned about and passionate about? And there's this bit that appears in chapter 26 and verse 16, and he's recounting the time when he met Jesus. Well, Jesus met him is probably more accurate. And it's talking there, you recognise the text, don't you, from, was it Acts chapter 9 or 8 or something like that. Jesus says to him, and Paul says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I'm Jesus who you're persecuting. Stand up. I've appeared to you, and I'm appointing you as a servant and a witness of what you've seen of me and what I will show you. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. And here it is. I am sending you to them, the Gentiles, to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to the power of God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place amongst those who are sanctified by faith in me. So here was the whole purpose of Christ in the Apostle Paul, to open the eyes of the Gentiles and to secure for them an opening, at least, an opportunity for them to be included amongst those who were sanctified. Now this at the time, of course, was revolutionary. How can these dirty old Gentiles possibly share in all that has been sanctified, all that is of the promises? And so, this was world-changing at that particular time, you have to remember. And even some of the apostles, like Peter, struggled enormously to get their head around all of that. However, so there's a couple of things there that just set a scene or just link us back to Acts chapter 8. And perhaps you'd like to come back to me, or come with me to Acts chapter 8. And the story here, the incident that's going on here, that I want to speak about really, is this Ethiopian. Philip and the Ethiopian, and we pick it up at verse 26. So the context that's going on here with the Ethiopian man, I just want to have a little look at who this person was and how comes this meant so much at the time. Okay, so the context here is that the church is scattered because of the persecution, and of course, looking back again, Saul was at the heart of all this. Saul, who was to become Paul, he was the one, almost leading the charge to kill this church off at its grassroots, to nip it in the bud. And as a result, the church was scattered. It talks about that at the beginning of chapter 8. Scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Stephen had been buried and they mourned him. But verse 3, Saul began to destroy the church. And we can only imagine, kind of what that must have been like, how frightened ordinary people would have become. Who put their heart and their trust in Jesus, and now all this was happening. And verse 4 of chapter 8, we hear about Philip, who has turned up in the city of Samaria, proclaiming the Christ there. And he seems to have really, tapped into something which has immense potential, because Samaria and the gospel being preached in Samaria seems to have really caught hold. They paid close attention to what he says, they said. There was great joy in that city, it says in verse 8. And then you have to deal with this Simon chap. Well, that's okay, fair enough. But then the response is so great that it seems as though, if you pick it up in verse 14 of chapter 8, that the big guns come down to have a look and check it all out. So John and Peter, these heavyweights, come down to support what's going on in verse 14 through to about 16, 17. And that must have been a great encouragement to Philip, to have the support of Peter and John alongside him. And then comes this kind of message to Philip, which is variously described as a sort of, as an angel, and in verse 29 it's described as the Spirit, to go and find a particular individual on a particular road journey at a particular time of a particular day. Somehow or other this message comes to Philip. Here's what I need you to do. I want you to go there, get your Google map out, and I want you to put in this postcode, as it were, and time it such that you arrive on this particular road at this particular junction where this particular person is going to be travelling along it. Sort of. We didn't have that technology. We've got better now, although not perfect. So what this event is about, I think, for us, is the impact it has for us to understand the power of the gospel to save and to change. That's really what this episode is about, I think, with this Ethiopian eunuch. The power of the gospel to save and to change. It also tells us about how the God that we worship, in amongst organising and running the entire universe, shall we say, somehow or other has a particular regard and an intimate knowledge of every one of the people on this planet whose heart is at least open to hearing of him. The individual nature of the gospel message, and the individual nature, the personal nature of God's intervention in our lives, which says, here's a heart that, I can sow a seed in this. I can work with this particular individual. And to me that is incredible when you think of the scale of the things that God has in his hands. That he's, this great big God, and yet he holds us as personal individuals in his hands. And here he is demonstrating that in the life of this Ethiopian fella. He's got nothing to do with much, God, nothing really. And yet, somehow or other, here's an example of how God works in the lives of each of us. Let's think who this Ethiopian was. Well, it's fairly clear from the text. He was from Ethiopia, and he was also a eunuch. Okay, we read. So, and he was heading, according to the text, he was heading for Gaza, which is where he lived, right? The word Gaza means treasure, interestingly enough. He was heading home to Gaza, having visited Jerusalem. And it says that he'd gone to Jerusalem to worship there. And straight away you think, well, hold on, he's an Ethiopian. What's he gone to Jerusalem for? To worship. That's interesting. He was a man of some authority under the Queen of Ethiopia. It says he's in charge of all her treasure. So that probably makes him a sort of a George Osborne chap, doesn't he? Sort of a Chancellor of the Exchequer type, maybe. But somebody in charge of, a senior politician, statesman, whatever we might describe him as. And don't forget, Ethiopia wasn't the kind of poor, we can't have an image of Ethiopia from more recent times as being a devastated, starved and sort of. It wasn't like that in those. It was more like the breadbasket of the region. It was very fertile and very. It wasn't a poor place like it is today, or has been in this last generation or two. He was probably a proselyte. In other words, somebody who converted to Judaism. Maybe that's why he was going to Jerusalem to worship. Now, what's the background to that? How did he become that? We don't know. We're not told. But it's interesting just to ponder, isn't it? But certainly his visit to Jerusalem is obviously more than just a business trip. Maybe it was a business trip for some reason that he combined with the opportunity. Whilst I'm there, I'm going to go and worship at the temple. So I'm going to do my worshipping there. But certainly the intention is, as declared, that he was there to worship. And you can imagine perhaps this long journey with the idea of being in Jerusalem wouldn't be fantastic. And he's got this high level of expectation and a smile on his face as he's thinking about how wonderful it's going to be able to worship there. However, something hasn't gone right. Something's perhaps upset him. Something has caused him to think. And here he is on his way back to Gaza in this particular place. Something had, queered the pitch somewhere or other. And he's thinking about this as he's travelling back to Gaza, we might imagine. And here he is, he's reading the book of Isaiah, or he's reading from Isaiah. Why Isaiah? Well, maybe it was all he could get at the time. It wasn't as though he could buy a Bible kind of thing, and everything was in there. There was a scroll available with the record of Isaiah, perhaps, or this part of Isaiah, and it's what he had, and he was reading it on his way back. It's chapter 53, as we have it, that he seems to have been looking at. And maybe he was looking for something particular in that chapter. Maybe there was something in that chapter that kind of resonated with him and he could identify with. Because it's a well-known chapter to us, isn't it, Isaiah chapter 53? About the suffering servant, Messiah, and so on. And it's about somebody that is essentially kind of denied justice. Somebody, it speaks about there as somebody who has no direct descendants or children of his own. And maybe, those things may have just sort of, I recognise something of that in myself, perhaps he was thinking. But certainly, whatever it was that he was reading about, something was intriguing to him. And so what might that have been? Well, I wonder also whether it was because his experience in Jerusalem had been the fact that here he was as a foreigner who was, as a result of that, probably denied entry beyond a certain point in the temple worship. So he'd gone to worship in Jerusalem with a hope and an expectation, and he'd been denied it because, well, you're a foreigner. And he wasn't only just a foreigner, he was a eunuch. And as a eunuch, he probably would have been turned away altogether. So just come back to Deuteronomy with me. And just hold your breath for a minute while I read this one verse. It's not all that pleasant, but I'll read it anyway. Okay, in chapter 23 of Deuteronomy, in the first verse, it talks about, this person's exclusion. No one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord. That's a eunuch, right? So here we are, a very kind of forthright way of describing that this man, because of who he was, as well as where he'd come from, was excluded from the assembly, not allowed to worship in the way that he perhaps hoped to or wanted to. And he was conscious, as a result of this, and maybe his experience in Jerusalem, that he was conscious of his difference. He was conscious of this exclusion, of this prejudice. And all this was brought home to him as he came to Jerusalem to worship. But we learn something about this man, don't we, in the way that the record sort of unwinds in Acts chapter 8. We learn something of the character of this man. You see, God's not interested, he didn't pick him because, he didn't go and reveal himself to this man because of his wealth or his position. I think he saw this man as being somebody whose heart was open. There was something about him where God felt that he could work. There was something he could work with. Like I said before, into which a seed could be sown and a response was possible. And doesn't it say something about how God, I think, continues to work? He's not... To God, it's not about where we've been or how, what our status is or anything like that. It's nothing to do with that. It's about what's the condition of this heart and this mind as being receptive, open, interested, willing to entertain the fact that this world, this life, may not all be about me. And it might be about other things as well. Philip catches up with the fella, and he's probably in a kind of he's probably accompanied by several people as well, but he catches up with him and asks him if he understands what he's reading. And, if he was a senior kind of fella, and all of a sudden this ragtag Philip starts running up alongside his chariot and calling, "Hey, do you know what you're reading?" And the guards around him or whatever else. You can imagine him saying, "Excuse me, who do you think you are?" But he doesn't, does he? He's receptive. There's a humility about him when he says, "How can I unless somebody helps me with this?" And that's a wonderful kind of, it's evidence of the fact that this man's heart was of a humility kind of sort of type, isn't it? He was willing to recognise that maybe he wasn't the great I am and the I've got all the answers sort of person. And it's important that we understand ourselves in that same kind of light, really. This was a person who seems as though he wants to find out, he wants to know, he wants to have answers. And I think when we are like that ourselves, and we can come to God in that spirit, then God helps us. God works with us, shall we say, and is responsive. If you just contrast that for a second, just going slightly off piece back to Felix, in the chapter that we read there, what does Felix do when he's listening to Paul expounding the gospel? He says, "Oh, I'm really, really interested." Later on we find he was only interested because he was hoping for a bride. You know? So, different. See the difference of the response? Let's come back to this Ethiopian, because he's reading about someone who has made himself a sacrifice for the sins of others. And he's wanting to explore what that means. Whose sins? Is he talking about my sins? And so Philip does what Romans 10 tells us to do. So I'm just going to go to Romans chapter 10 and this is a good chapter to read in the context of Acts chapter 8, by the way, I think anyway, because it's interesting. But just in particular, verse 14. How can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? How can they preach unless they are sent? You know, it sort of speaks about the Ethiopian, it speaks about Philip as well in that little context, doesn't it? How can he understand unless somebody's able to help him understand and explain? And really interesting, as it was written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. I mean, that's Philip in that particular instance, isn't it? He's running along with the good news. Here he is, the feet of those who bring good news, being portrayed in that instance by Philip. Okay, so he's preaching the gospel to him, helping him understand, and I suspect that it's likely that he did the whole thing from Isaiah. Well, why wouldn't he? If he had, supposing he had the whole of Isaiah, and that was all he had with him, you know, he's expounding the whole of the gospel from the book of Isaiah, and it's possible to do so, isn't it? Why? Because Jesus is everywhere in the book of Isaiah. He's there as from his expected birth in chapter 9 through to his, you know, the wonderful counselor kind of part, you know, the Son of God, the sovereign majesty of Christ, repeated references to the servant king, and so on. So it's possible, I think, to preach the gospel in its, you know, in its essence, certainly from Isaiah. But I wonder if actually it's Isaiah chapter 56, as we have it, that may have been the real kind of heart of where he based his talk from. Not that he was talking in that kind of way, but you know what I mean. I wonder whether he went to Isaiah chapter 56 as we've got it, because it resonated most strongly with this Ethiopian. Have a look at Isaiah chapter 56. It's almost as though it was written for him, right? So, what does it say in verse 3 of Isaiah 56? Let no foreigner who has bound himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. And let not any eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree. So, in the plan and purpose of God, in the opening up of the gospel, all of a sudden, there's an opening up of freedom and opportunity for this man. The fact that he's a foreigner, if he's bound to the Lord, he's not going to be excluded. And don't let the eunuch complain, I'm only a dry tree, I'm no good for anything. Because that's not the case in Christ. Verse 5, supposing Philip said to him, and to you I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. The fact that you haven't got sons and daughters, think broader than that, think bigger than that. Because to you, I'm going to give a name that's better than sons and daughters. I will give you an everlasting name that won't be cut off. Think what that might have meant to that individual. at that moment, as he's just come from Jerusalem and all the sort of can do this, can't do that kind of world, and he meets this Philip fella, and all of a sudden, everything that would have been so hard for him to take because of his condition, because of his background, where he came from, all of a sudden is transformed from this gospel that's preached to him. And verse 6, foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to serve him, to love the name of the Lord and to worship him, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant, these, Mr. Ethiopian Eunuch, I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Well, he didn't have joy in the house of prayer where he'd just been, but now, you know, this is what is meant, this is what the gospel has done for him. So specific, so relevant to this individual, it could have been written for him. I think that's incredible. So here's a man whose job was about managing treasure. And he's heading for a town called Treasure. And on the way, he finds treasure. The treasure of the gospel of Christ. The treasure of knowing that he, in faith, can belong to something which is just amazing and you know, so far-reaching and so inclusive. And he's transformed by this experience and by this revealing of the Scripture. Thank you to Philip. He's transformed from a situation of sadness into rejoicing. He's transformed from the world of exclusion to a world of inclusion. From confusion, because he didn't really know what it was all about, he couldn't work it out, from confusion into transparent understanding. It's so clear, it's so obvious, and it's so personal that I can respond to it. From a situation of prejudice, because of, you know, people were judging him and where he was from on one level. From prejudice to acceptance. That's the transformation. From somebody who was completely lost and cut off, somebody who was totally found, who's found treasure beyond his wildest expectations and possibility. Completely changed by what he read. Completely changed by what he heard, what he understood, and by the personal encounter of the acts of Jesus, continuing acts of Jesus through the individual which is called Philip in this instance. Perhaps because he was the fastest runner, I don't know. But he was, you know, it was Jesus talking to this man in the person of Philip, you know, for all intents and purposes. No wonder he's saying, stop, I've just got to be baptized into this. I just want this. And nobody's saying to him, yeah, but I've got a 12-part correspondence course to do. You know, we've got an interview to... No, there's nothing like that. It's simply saying, if you absolutely believe this and feel that your heart and mind has been transformed by it, go for it. We'll work out the details. You know, I shouldn't say that, should I? But, you know, let's think about it. So what's the message for us then? Are we changed? Because, believe it or not, we have had that same experience on the road to Gaza. Okay, in a way. So are we changed? We shouldn't forget ever where we've come from. We have come from a place and a position where we are excluded. Don't ever forget it. By our sins, by the fact that, our human condition, at very least, has meant that one day past, we were completely excluded from any of this. Unclean, ceremonially and any other way as well. Unable to enter, shut out, until Jesus came. And it's Jesus who has broken down that, what is described in Ephesians, isn't it? This dividing wall of hostility. He's ripped apart the curtain for us to be able to go in with him. into the very presence of God, and somehow or other for that to be acceptable and for it to be perfectly good. Jesus had a view on clean and unclean, didn't he? You know, ceremonially, strictly, according to the Pharisaical law and other, he touched the leper. He raised the dead and touched the dead. No wonder he was falling out with the authorities. But with Jesus, the point of Jesus is that he connects with our uncleanness. Because in Isaiah, that chapter 53 of Isaiah, he talks about how that he took up our infirmities and he carried our sorrows. Jesus was one who connected with our condition. He aligned himself to us. He understood us and came to be where we are. And in what he did, he secured the victory. Absolutely secured the victory. We've heard a lot about victories this week. David Cameron, victory. Victory in Europe Day, big celebration, bells ringing last night, wasn't there, in London, and all that noise around victory. And yet our victory is, we talk about VE Day, how about a victory forever day? This is Christ and what he's achieved for us. Victory forever. That's what it's described as in Hebrews, isn't it? Sacrifice once and for all. So it's a case of how much we appreciate what's happened to us. We're no longer separated, we are included. Not only are we able to worship, but we have been given that name which is greater than. We've become adopted sons and daughters, children of the living God. And so who did the Lord send for you on your road? You look back at us, it's interesting, isn't it, to just look back onto your life and think, who did the Lord send for me? There was somebody. What was it? And often it's an individual or it's a set of circumstances that you can identify, just think about it, as being just that. It was the continuing acts of Jesus affecting your life, to turn you around, to find treasure for you. And I think that's an amazing thing to think about as well. Great news. So, I think we should be like the Ethiopian. I think we should be like the Ethiopian whose heart was open and it was ready to say, yes, I want this. Absolutely, my eyes are open, this is what I want. And I think also we should be like Philip. Because Philip was one who equally said yes. When that angel or that spirit or whatever it was said to him, Philip, get your sat-nav out because I've got a job for you and I want you to go there and do this in my name. And he went. And that's the calling for us as well. To be involved, to go and to save in the name of Christ.